Hey everybody, John Fenn here, Church Without Walls International, CWOWI.org. Today I'm going to go part 2 on sins and trespasses. You'll recall from Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 1, Paul wrote that God in his great mercy and goodness, forgave us of our trespasses and sins. Just a refresher course in case you haven't seen part 1. That is that a trespass is horizontal. It is a sin against another person. It deals with the injury. A sin is vertical, and it's between you and God, something you do that involves nobody else, just you and God. So that a sin involves the guilt and the trespass involves the injury. So we could say it this way: all trespasses are sins, but not all sins are trespasses. All right, so this is based on the law of the trespass from Leviticus chapter 6, verses 1 through 7. And that real quickly, I want to get down to how it functioned. That is, if somebody trespassed against another, they would go to them and be reconciled. Jesus placed great emphasis on the person receiving the request to be forgiven to forgive that person. In fact, in Matthew chapter 18, Peter came to him and said, "How many times should I forgive my brother of his trespasses there?" And Jesus said, if he comes to you and repents 70 times in a day, 70 times 7 in a day, you'll forgive him. So Jesus puts great emphasis on the person who's been trespassed against, forgiving the person who did the trespassing. So in Leviticus chapter 6, verses 1 through 7, that person who trespassed goes to them to be reconciled. So that person has to make it right, restore if they stole something or got by deceit, they restore it. And that person who they're asking to be reconciled to, Jesus said that's what you have to deal with. You have to forgive them. Then they too go to the priest. And when they go to the priest will assign a fine to the person who trespassed. And together they will make their sacrifice to the Lord. But Jesus said this, he talked about this. He said, if you don't seek reconciliation and if you don't forgive, then obviously you cannot go to make that sacrifice to the Lord to be forgiven. You can't make that sacrifice to be forgiven. You can't make that sacrifice to say, look, we're reconciled, we're rejoicing in the Lord. That sacrifice will never be made. So God from heaven can't forgive the trespass. That's not talking about salvation. They're still believers in the God of Israel. But it has to do with the trespass, that the Father cannot forgive the trespass if they too will not be reconciled and go to the priest to make it official. So when Jesus is talking about this, in Matthew chapter 18, for instance, he talks about in verse 11 through 14, he talks about the parable of the lost sheep. He said, which of you has 100 sheep and then one of them goes astray into the wilderness? Won't you leave the 99 and go after the 100th one? And he says in verse 15, moreover, if your brother trespasses against you. So Jesus is talking about the parable of the lost sheep, the 100 sheep, and one of them goes into the wilderness. He's talking about forgiveness. And he says, if somebody trespasses against you in verse 15, then you go to him and seek reconciliation. If he won't be reconciled, take one or two others and seek reconciliation. If he won't go to you, take the case to the leaders of the church, he said. Now that would be a house church. So you're talking couples, you're talking individuals, you're talking people who are the core leaders of that house church. He said, if he won't listen to them, each step of the way, they're trying to reconcile with him and bring it to him and say, let's do this. And Jesus said, then he would be like a heathen and a publican, which means that doesn't mean to shun them. How many pastors have gotten it wrong and said, we've got to ignore this person. If you see them in public, you turn the other way. That's not what Jesus said. I mean, this is Matthew chapter 18, verses 11 through about 21, where Jesus is talking about this. In Matthew 5, a few chapters earlier, he said, you pray for those who hate you. You do good to them who've done you wrong. You need to be perfect in love like your Father in heaven is mature or complete or perfect in love. He causes the sun to shine on the just and the unjust and the rain to fall on the just and the unjust. You've got to be like that in your love. So when Jesus later says, if he won't listen to the one and he won't listen to the one or two or three of the others and he won't listen to the leadership, then you treat them like they're not saved, like a heathen and publican, a tax collector, then you treat them. He's talking about walking in love towards them. And then he says this, if two or three are gathered, who are the two or three that are gathered in his name, where Jesus is in the midst? The two or three are the ones who are trying to reconcile with this brother. And why is Jesus in their midst? because he's the great shepherd. The guys have done everything they can to be reconciled with their brother, and now they're asking the shepherd to go into the wilderness to get that 100th sheep, that one that went astray. And so they're meeting in agreement, and they are taking authority over the demonic forces that have gotten hold of this guy, who've influenced him to be in unforgiveness, and they are loosing the great shepherd to go into the wilderness to seek reconciliation for their brother. And then Peter comes immediately after that and says, okay, Jesus, how many times in a day? And Jesus says 70 times 7. If he comes to you, you forgive him. And Jesus also goes into the parable of the wicked servant immediately after this, where he owes a bunch of money, and then he goes and he treats all the other servants harshly and throws them into prison. And Jesus says, that guy who's in danger, he said, I showed you mercy. You should have shown them mercy and been reconciled. It's still the law of the trespass. The rest of Matthew chapter 18. And what does he say to that guy who won't forgive? He says he throws him into prison until he pays what he owes. And so that's talking the law of the trespass, the fine that the priest would have assigned him. So people misunderstand this, and they don't understand, Jesus' words. Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 through 26 is another example, where it says, you've heard the law say, you shall not murder. But I say to you, if you hate your brother without a cause, you're in danger of judgment, which means you're in danger of that priest assigning you a fine and throwing you into prison. He says, if you say Raka, R-A-C-A, this is Matthew chapter 5 and verse 22, 23. And he says Raka, which means you moron. It's actually the Greek word moros, M-O-R-O-S, which means moron. You retarded person, you dummy, you stupid person. He said, you're in danger of the Sanhedrin. And he says, if you say you fool, you're in danger of hell. That's because, as every Jewish person would have recognized when Jesus said it, Psalm 14:1 says, a fool says in his heart, there is no God. So what Jesus is saying, you're taking the place of God. You're making a judgment call on somebody's salvation, and we're not to do that. We're to judge the fruit, but we're not to judge the heart. And so Jesus, in Matthew chapter 5, from verse 21 on, he's talking about walking in love and forgiveness, and talking about how, if you hate your brother without a reason, you're in danger of judgment, the priest levying a fine, maybe throwing you into prison. And if you call him, you idiot, you stupid person, etc., your hatred is accelerating, your unforgiveness is accelerating, it's getting more intense, you're in danger of the Sanhedrin. That is the ruling council. They could fine you, they could throw you into prison, they could cast you out of the synagogue. And if you step it up and say that you're not even saved, you call them a fool says in his heart there is no God, you're taking the place of God, and you're in danger of severe judgment at that point. See, all this is the law of the trespass. I've shared before, Mark chapter 11, verses 25 and 26. As you stand praying, forgive. If you don't forgive others' trespasses against you, your Father in heaven won't forgive you your trespasses. What is this? This is the law of the trespass. If you too, right there, he says, hey, forgive me, and you say, I don't want to forgive you. You hurt me. Our relationship is damaged forever. If you don't reconcile, then you can't go to the priest to make the sacrifice, so the Father cannot forgive you your trespasses. It's the bind and loose. If you don't loose their trespasses, then your Father is not loosed to forgive you your trespasses. If you hold on to those trespasses, you are binding that, then the Father is also bound in heaven from forgiving you yours. It's very simple. It doesn't have to do with salvation. It has to do with the wood, hay, and stubble. In the Old Testament law, they're still the believers in the God of Israel. It's just they're taking to their deathbed these bitternesses and unforgivenesses and things of that nature, grudges that they're keeping in their heart. And Paul said again, 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 1 through 15, that is wood, hay, and stubble that would be burned away on the Lord Jesus in the time of Jesus. So what happens if time's gone by? Real quickly, you say, oh no, that happened 10, 20 years ago. Do I have to go to them? No, it's not like that at all. They have dealt with it. You've dealt with it. It's settled somehow in the heart, but now you know. Now you know. And remember, Stephen in Acts chapter 7, verse 60, said, Lord, lay not this sin to their charge. That is, release them of that trespass, and the Father will do that. Jesus said in John 20:23, at his resurrection, he says, you have the power to remit, that is, forgive sins or retain them. You have that authority to do that. Jesus from the cross said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. You can release a person. So I encourage you to release the person from that. And you may have to deal with the injury. I understand. You may have to deal with the injury. You make the decision to forgive, but you may have to deal with the injury over 5 or 10 years. It can take a long time to deal with the hurt and the injustice and everything that you experience. But you bring your emotions back to that forgiveness decision that you made some years earlier. You work your way through the emotions and then you bring it back. So, yeah, there's so much to get into, and I've gone over my normal 10-minute time frame, but I wanted to get into this to understand that just forgive. Just make the decision to forgive. Whether and if you injured somebody, then you need to go to them and be reconciled. If it's not if it's something that they would receive. Sometimes people go like, "What are you doing? That's so long ago. It's not even. I'm not even thinking about it." And you'll know that you don't need to do that. But from this point forward, now you know what the New Testament says. That's why James 5:16, again, confess your trespasses one to another, that you may be, and pray for one another that you may be healed. James 5:16 is about the trespass. In the Greek, it's trespass. It's the exact same thing that he said in the law of the trespass from Leviticus chapter 6. You go to him, confess your fault, pray for one another, let the relationship be healed. All right. Anyway, gone on a little bit. I hope it's been a blessing to you. New subject next week.